I want to begin with the text, and I want to highlight in talking about the New Testament text and the manuscripts that we have, and the reliability of the text that we have, that this is just the beginning of the issue when we come to reliability. Some presentations in apologetics sound like if we know we have the text that was written in the first century, then we know the Bible is reliable. It's not that simple. Knowing that we have what the text is the starting point for the conversation. But then, as you're well aware, with in interaction with skeptics and that kind of thing, that we may agree with them. Oh, we have the text. That's not the problem. The question is whether the text itself and what it says and articulates is reliable. That's a whole other layer of the conversation. And so, even though sometimes the impression is sometimes left in some of the presentations I've seen that if you solve the manuscript problem, you've solved the New Testament problem, that's only on an assumption that we may have that people we interact with don't, and that is that the Bible is the Word of God and it's true. And so if I have the text, then that's all I need and we're done. And if that were the case, I would let you go and you can go home in the next 10 minutes. Okay, but that's not the case. So, but the way this issue works is we have about slightly more than 5,800 Greek manuscripts and about over 8,000 Latin manuscripts. I mention the Latin because the Bible of the early church for a long time was the Latin Bible. And our problem with regard to text, sometimes you'll hear people who are skeptical say, oh, that there are hundreds of thousands of variants. Actually, it's not inaccurate. There are probably hundreds of thousands of variants because we're talking about, at least in terms of main manuscripts, if you do the math quickly, 6,000, 8,000, we have about 14,000 manuscripts. So if you have, just a few dozen copy errors in a manuscript, per manuscript, you're already moving up into the hundreds of thousands in terms of difference. But most of these differences are differences that you can spot and you can know what's going on. I like to compare this to an email that you might get or a text that you might get where someone has typed really, really quickly, and lo and behold, there's a word in there that really doesn't make sense, but if you have enough context, you can figure out what it is that they were intending to say because they've just made a typo. And so some of the variations are variations of spelling of names. Others are issues of word order in Greek because Greek is what's called an inflected language. It indicates what the word is doing in the sentence by the way the ending on the word works. So you can put your sentence in any order that you want in terms of word order, and it will still mean the same thing because of the inflection on the language. So some of the differences are differences in word order and sequence. There are some differences that are really real, but what I tell people is the simple way to say it, is our problem is we have the text plus. We have the text as it was given, plus all the variations that were introduced in the text by copyists as they tried to meticulously copy the Bible from word to word. And I like to remind people, the reason you're able to hold a Bible in your hands and interact with it is because there were faithful people over centuries of time who were willing to sit down and copy the language of the Bible and the wording of the Bible literally word by word. Sometimes I think it's easy to forget that. And so as they did so, they made mistakes and errors, and in some cases they introduced changes. Some of those changes were intentional because they read something in the wording that they had and they went, well, that can't be right. It must have meant this. So some changes are like that. So there's a range of difference that we get in what are called the variants. And I tell people, this is the simple way. If you remember one thing I say about this section, this is what to remember. The problem that we have is that we don't have 100% of the text. We have 105% of the text. In other words, we have the text plus the variants. And then text criticism is designed to help us sort out what belongs in the original and what doesn't. And for the vast amount of variance that we have, well over 99%, we know what the wording is vis-a-vis the variance. And then the ones that are debatable will sometimes even show up if you have a study Bible or a Bible that has notes alongside of it that tells what some of the variants are. They will signal to you what the options are. So we either have the text, and in virtually every case we also know what the options are where we're not certain about the text. Then one other fact is very, very important in thinking about the text, and it's this, that these differences have no impact. Virtually everybody who works in this area has agreed on this. Makes no impact on the core doctrines of Christianity. What's affected is how many verses teach the various points that one might be making. So the question is, does this doctrine have, 7 verses that teach it or 9 verses that teach it? That kind of thing. The variations tend to impact in that kind of way. And for centuries, really, people who've studied this have said the impact on the core doctrines of Christianity, we don't lose anything. Let me say it that way. We don't lose anything about what that content is as a result of these differences. The next issue is the issue of miracles. The issue, of course, are miracles and the dilemma of revelation and miracles in a modern world. I was doing an interview about this session yesterday for the forum, and in the midst of it, miracles came up. And of course, the way I like to make this point is to make an opening statement, which is, if you don't believe in miracles, you're going to have a problem with the Bible, because there's just a few of them in there. Okay? So there's a challenge with regard to the expressed worldview that the Bible contains, which is that there is a God, that He's active in the creation, that He was the creator, and that sometimes, oh my, He may act in the creation. And so that's the Christian perspective. And of course, how does one assess what's so central to the narrative? And so what you find people doing is, with the Bible, who are naturalists, is when they hit passages that are about miracles, they either say they're made up, or they'll attribute it to a literary genre and say, well, this is a mythic element of the Bible, something like that. Or they'll reinterpret the miracle so that it's not as miraculous as it sounds. Let me give you an example of this, because it's in one sense a humorous one. And that is the feeding of the 5,000, which happens to be a miracle that is the only miracle that's in all 4 Gospels. And the way in which naturalists will handle that text is to say, because remember, you've got the very limited number of fish and loaves, right? When they go do the inventory about how we're going to feed this crowd of 5,000 people. And the numbers 5 and 2 don't match 5,000, right? So you're worried about how you're going to, a skeptical interpretation of this, not the only one, but a skeptical interpretation of this is, this text depicts the fact that when Jesus preached, and He preached on love and the themes that He had, He was so persuasive that people took the food that they had and shared it with their neighbor. Okay? And so all of a sudden, the miracle of feeding the 5,000 isn't Jesus producing food for the neighbors. It is the impact of Jesus in His preaching, which, in one sense, if you just take it as a raw message, you go, well, that could preach. Okay? But it isn't what the text is about. But it shows the impact of not having miracles, a belief in miracles in the text will have on the interpretation of the text. So what we have here when we're talking about miracles are conflicting horizons and colliding presuppositions. Whose perception of reality are we going to embrace? That's really what's going on here. And then here's something that I think most people don't appreciate, and that is that the struggle for the belief of miracles is a problem primarily in the West. That if you actually look at what most of the world believes, most of the world actually believes that there are spiritual forces out there, and most of the world actually believes that things like miracles can happen. If you have any doubt about this, Craig Keener wrote 2 very thick volumes recently in a work called Miracles. What's beautiful about this topic is the titles of the books are easy to remember. So in a book called Miracles, and in this book he documented the variety of miracle stories that exist in the world in recent times. And so, now obviously he couldn't go down and verify every one of these, but you get enough of them and all of a sudden you go, well, something's got to be going on here. So that's just a reminder that most of the world recognizes the reality of spiritual forces and power. It's materialism that denies it. And what's interesting is even postmodernism to some degree is open to the idea that there's something out there beyond what we can handle with our five senses. And if you have any doubt about this, just look at some modern films which oftentimes deal with these forces that are unseen that, can threaten us and that kind of thing. There's something going on there with worldview that opens up these kinds of conversations. Then there's a technical article that I assign my students by Mike Lacona on the issue of resurrection and miracles, and in which there's a note that he discusses both the Keener book and this idea of what's going on in the arts and how it shows that many people around us do actually believe there's something out there. They just don't know exactly how to define it and what it is. The moment you posit that, okay, you have opened the door for the discussion on miracles. Then last, the distancing of God and the location of humanity. The reason the presence of God and the reality of miracles is important is because people are designed for a stewardship relationship with God, and if all there is the material world, we've cut out the most important fact about life that exists. So there's a lot that's at stake in the discussion that revolves around miracles in the Bible. Now, I personally think that the best book dealing with miracles that exists even now is a book written years ago by C.S. Lewis, in which he pushes us to think about miracles and to think about how they work. And so C.S. Lewis says that the world is more than the material. That is what we can test with our five senses, namely seeing, hearing, smelling, touching, and tasting. And he argues that our reasoning ability as human beings is not merely material. Okay? It isn't just a combination of chemicals put in the right kind of order, and if we went into a lab and test tubed it and did the right chemistry and had the right biology, boom, all of a sudden we could think. He says our mind comes from another kind of ordering. And here's the quote from the book. It says, "Human minds, then, are not the only supernatural entities that exist. They do not come from nowhere. Each has come into nature from supernature. Each has its taproot in an eternal, self-existent, rational being who we call God. Each is an offshoot or spearhead or incursion of that supernatural reality into nature." What he is doing is explaining one of the impacts of what it means to be made in the image of God and what makes humans unique. Another quote later on says, "We are interested in man only because his rationality is the little telltale rift in nature which shows there is something beyond or behind her." So his argument is because we can think, because we can talk about a thing like a soul, because there is rationality, and that's not strictly speaking something that we see, touch, hear, smell, or taste. That points to a spiritual reality that's out there, which he posits in relationship to God. He says, "No philosophical theory which I have yet come across is a radical improvement on the words of Genesis that in the beginning God made heaven and earth." And then he goes on to say, and then there's this moral sense that we also have as a result of this, in which he says, "I ought" is not the same sort of statement as "I itch." Moral judgment requires more than nature. So a second argument that he's making is the idea that there is a morality and an orderliness in the world demands some element of design and some element of ethical dimension to that design. So this is how he approaches the topic of miracles. More quotes from Lewis. It says, "Man is a finite creature who has sense enough to know that he is finite. Therefore, on any conceivable view, he finds himself dwarfed by reality as a whole. He is also a derivative being The cause of his existence lies not in himself, but immediately in his parents, and ultimately either in the character of nature as a whole, or if there is a God, in God. But there must be something, whether it be God or the totality of nature, which exists in its own right and goes on of its own accord, not as the product of causes beyond itself, but simply because it does. And then my comment in thinking about this text is, this is the idea that things exist outside of me. It is the opposite of Descartes, and Descartes' turn in philosophy where we focus, I think, therefore I am, was the birthplace of an intense individualism and individualized perspective that impacts the West. Anyway, it is the opposite of Descartes, I think, therefore I am. There is a real world beyond me. I am not God. Existence comes from elsewhere. And then the really raw way to say this is, when I die, I know the life of the world will go on. There's something out there. How did it get here? That kind of idea. So this perhaps, another quote, this perhaps helps to make a little clearer what the laws of nature really are. We are in the habit of talking as if they caused events to happen, but they have never caused any event at all. The laws of motion do not set billiard balls moving. They analyze the motion of something else, say a man with a cue, or the lurch of a liner, or perhaps a supernatural power has provided it. In other words, nature doesn't act on its own accord. Okay? The design of nature functions in certain ways, but something has brought that design to have the cause and effect that takes place. Something triggered that process, is the point that he's trying to make. It is therefore inaccurate to define a miracle as something that breaks the laws of nature. In fact, even the word supernatural is a little misleading, okay? Because the world that God created and everything in it is part of the natural that is a part of our world, okay? What makes it supernatural is it's not the normal, okay? So, therefore, it's inaccurate to define a miracle as something that breaks the laws of nature. If God annihilates or creates or deflects a unit of matter, he has created a new situation at that point. And so the question becomes, is he there and is he active? That's really the core question. On nature, he says, everything becomes different when we recognize nature is a creature, a created thing with its own particular, and then I like the way he says things, tang or flavor. Okay, only a British person could say something like that. So anyway, American would never say it that way. So that's the thinking about miracles. More quotes. So here's more. On David Hume, who is responsible for undercutting the belief of miracles in the West, he says this: the question, do miracles occur, and the question, is the course of nature absolutely uniform, are the same question asked in two different ways. Hume, by sleight of hand, treats them as two different questions. He first answers yes to the question whether nature is absolutely uniform, and then he uses this yes as a ground of answering no to the question, do miracles occur? The single question which he set out to answer is never discussed at all. He gets the answer to one form of the question by assuming the answer to another form of the question. And then my comment here, when we ask about nature, we're asking about the framing of the question. Is the universe closed or open? That's actually the question. Is the universe closed or open? And how do we test that answer? By science. And the answer to that is we can't. So that's the real debate. Is there a creator who operates outside the creation but is engaged with it so that nature itself is open to the activity of this spiritual being? Or is nature its own self-contained permanent entity that's closed in and of itself and doesn't need an outside force to act? And Lewis is saying it's open, and everything about the way that it operates tells you that it's open, because the spiritual, the rational is beyond the material. That's what he's arguing. Next quote. Naturalism is true. If naturalism is true, we have no reason to trust our conviction that nature is uniform. This is going in the opposite direction now. by assuming the premise and then saying then the implication that's drawn from that premise can't be demonstrated. It can be trusted only if a quite different metaphysic is true. If the deepest thing in reality, the fact which is the source of all other facthood, is a thing in some degree like ourselves, if it is a rational spirit and we derive our rational spirituality from it, then indeed our conviction can be trusted. Our repugnance to disorder is derived from nature's creator and ours. The disorderly world, which we cannot endure to believe, is the disorderly world he would not have endured to create. Our conviction that the timetable will not be perpetually or meaninglessly altered is sound because we have, in a sense, eavesdropped in the Master's common room. We've gone into the Master's living room, if you will. Note the focus on orderliness, which is what Genesis 1 is ultimately about in its core. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and He gave it an order and an orderliness and a structure that it operates by. It's really part of what Genesis 1 is all about. One more. This is probably the most famous quote in the entire book. But if we admit God, must we admit miracle? Indeed, you have no security against it. That is the bargain. Theology says to you, in effect, admit God and with Him the risk of a few miracles, and I in return will ratify your faith in uniformity as regards the overwhelming majority of events. Just a really wonderful summary quote. The philosophy which forbids you to make uniformity absolute is also the philosophy which offers you solid grounds for believing it to be general and to believe it is almost absolute. Theology offers you a working arrangement which leaves the scientist free to continue his experiments and the Christian to continue his prayers. Just a marvelously succinct, crisp quote. So this is Lewis's general argument with regard to miracles. This is where his argument to miracles ends. He then turns his attention specifically in the book to talking about the miracle of Jesus' life, which I'm going to come back to in a little bit. But he turns his attention to explaining particular miracles. He starts with the incarnation itself, not just the resurrection, because the incarnation itself is, if it's really true, a miracle. How does the Creator God present Himself at the same time as human? Okay? And Jesus is one in a gazillion. He is the unique, grand miracle. In fact, let me say this in a way that should bother you the rest of our time together. It goes like this. When you share Jesus as the Son of God to someone who has no religious bone in their body, okay, in the United States, about 30% of our population is described as the religious nuns. That's not N-U-N-S, okay, but N-O-N-E-S, okay? They don't have any religious orientation. They have no place for God. They have no belief in God, etc. When you say Jesus is the Son of God, and you say that to them, what have you said to them? What do they hear? Okay, they don't have the category for it. That's the point. Now, that actually shouldn't surprise us, because think of all the human beings who've ever walked the earth. Okay, I once asked Google, how many human beings, because Google knows everything, how many human beings have walked the earth in the history of the world? They actually gave me a number, 117 billion. Now, I didn't ask the follow-up question, how do you know this? Okay, but let's say that's more or less correct, that 117 billion human beings at one point or another in the history of the world have walked on the earth. Now, I ask the next question. How many of those human beings have been able to credibly offer that they are also the Creator God incarnate? Just one. Which tells you it's a little bit of an unusual category. And if someone is not theologically oriented or inclined, it's a really unusual category. I tell people when they engage with sharing the gospel with someone who doesn't have a religious background, they're actually in the business of creating categories that people who are listening to them do not have. Okay? That is a presupposition before we ever talk about the gospel, is that category needs to be appreciated. So that's, I'm going to come back to this later because this is part of what's wrapped up in these conversations. So the second half of the book, which I'm not going to discuss, deals with Jesus, his incarnation, and the resurrection, making the point that Jesus is one in a gazillion, and a gazillion is just a very big number. And in one sense can be referred to as the grand miracle. Let's go back to our list. The nature of the witnesses and oral tradition. Now let me state this as a problem, and then you'll appreciate why I've brought the 12 in here. So we have the events of Jesus, which are tied to the timing of his life and ministry, which is either variously put somewhere between 27 and 33 AD. No matter who you talk to in New Testament, now that's longer than the 3.5 years we talk about, because there's a 3-year difference in the two most common views about the dates of Jesus' life, and ministry rather. And that is, it either went from 27 to 30 or 30 to 33, more or less. So there are two options that are out there. He was crucified either in 33 or he was crucified in 30. Those are the two primary options that exist. So there's a 6-year window. Okay, now, so think about this. Yeah, so think about this as a timeline. So we're here, these are the events. We don't get the written Gospels in all likelihood when we're talking about Mark, and I think Mark is likely the first Gospel written. Some people think it's Matthew, but this point doesn't alter too much depending, because what the conservative date that's given to that writing, whether it's Mark or Matthew, is somewhere in the 60s. Okay? So we're 30 years. That gap that I just walked represents 30 years. If we talk about the Gospel of John, however, okay, most people date John in the 90s. That's 60 years. Oh my goodness, look at that gap. There's all kinds of things that can happen in there. Okay, and that's the argument. The argument is that in the period between the events and their writing down in Scripture, okay, and the people who are the authors weren't necessarily eyewitnesses, not all of them were eyewitnesses and apostles, okay? We have a 30 to 60 year gap, and there's all kinds of things that can happen in there because we're dealing with a world in which stories were passed on not by being written down, but orally. We're in an oral world. So this introduces the idea of orality. So we're dealing with the reality of oral tradition being the way in which the Jesus story was passed on over the centuries. So there's a gap. I have a lecture that I give on this, specifically dedicated to this topic, and I remind people that when they go to London, or if they go to Sydney, or if they go to Munich, there are subways. And in English, you always get the sign, mind the gap. Okay, you mind the gap because they want you to step from the side street into the subway car and not hit the gap in between, or else you'll have a Hades experience that they're trying to help you avoid. So you're trying to move from one space to the other. So I tell people, in thinking about the development of the gospel story and the way it comes to us in Scripture, we've got to mind the gap. We've got to think about, and most people don't even think about this, what has been going on from the time of those events and their recollection all the way out to the recording of these events in text. Okay? Now, Christians tend not to worry about this stuff. And the reason they tend not to worry about this stuff is because we have a belief that says, we think God was behind it all. Okay? If God's behind it all, that kind of solves the question for us. So we tend to worry less and live longer. Okay? That's just the way things work. But skeptical people ask questions about this gap period and what's going on in there, etc., that actually is a part of the process that was undertaken that takes us from the events to the writing down of Scripture. So it actually is a part of the conversation. So what do we do with this? So what I like to talk about, whenever you talk about this, you have to talk about memory, you have to talk about eyewitnesses, and you have to talk about the nature of the oral process itself in the ancient world. Okay? So let me pose this for you problematically as an initial posit so that you can hear how this gets addressed by skeptical people. So the argument can go like this. I actually had this conversation with John Crossan, who's one of the most famous writers of the historical Jesus in the 1980s and 1990s. And we were at an event together in which this was the topic, and I was responding to something that he presented. And he said, I'm willing to recognize that the gospel tradition is rooted in eyewitnesses. I don't have a problem with that premise. I'm even willing to recognize that those eyewitnesses walked and talked with Jesus. But the problem is the looseness of the oral tradition and, more importantly, memory leaks. What you remember, you don't always remember things accurately. Okay, that was his claim. And he even presented psychological experiments about memory that show this. That involved the Challenger disaster when the U.S. sent up a space probe with a science teacher from a junior high in it, and it exploded on launch. One of the most traumatic things that ever has happened to our space program. And so at Emory University there was an experiment, and the experiment was they went to freshmen at Emory University and asked them, where were you when the day the Challenger disaster happened, and how did you hear about it? They recorded the answers. Then, 4 years later, on the premise, which I will suggest to you is not always a great premise, that they were about to graduate, so they better ask them before they leave school. Okay? They called them back in, they asked them the same two questions. They compared the answer of what was given right after the event happened to where they were 4 years later. And in fully half of the examples, the answers were different. And then they went back to them and said, in effect, you gave us two answers to these questions and they're not the same. Which one's right? Okay? But the point that Crossan was making is memory adjusts, memory leaks. It's not, what you saw and what you experienced and what you remember at the time is not what you remember later. It's the point that they were making. So I was asked to respond to this. And the way I responded to it was to say, it's all very interesting, but let me make one observation. No one who at Emory University who was asked this question had anything significantly at stake in NASA. They were witnesses to something that was not in the middle of their lives. However, when we come to the testimony about the resurrection, we're talking about something that all the apostles were committed to, and they were committed to it by the point in which we're asking these questions, in which they were having to consider offering their lives for what it is they believed in. I said, I don't know this. I said, but I suspect that memory is better when you're directly connected and there's more at stake than when you're just a random witness to something, no matter how traumatic that is for the national well-being. That was the argument that I made. They've since done experiments on memory about this that examines that which is at stake for when someone has something at stake in what they're remembering versus they're just a random witness to it. And the point that I was making has shown to be true. Now, we still aren't completely to the point of 100% accuracy, but we're in a much better place. There's less leaking going on, is the point. So the point that I want to make here is that I want to make 2 points. The first is that you have to think about the way oral tradition actually works. I'm going to talk about that in a second. But here's the second point I want to make. And it is, whatever the nature of the memories on the details of what's going on, it's almost for sure likely that if you spent 3.5 years with someone listening teach day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, that you would have their basic understanding of what they taught right. Because we're not talking about isolated events. We're talking about how a person presents themselves over again and again and again and again and again. So the 12 are important because they oversaw the tradition. This wasn't tradition floating out in outer space. They oversaw the tradition. In fact, we know this because when Judas was replaced in Acts 1, what was the qualification for the person who was going to replace him? He had to be with us from the beginning, which is a nice way of saying he had to really know what Jesus taught. Okay? So this is the background of what we're talking about. So let me expand this area this way. Let's talk about orality. So I've talked about memory and I've talked about eyewitnesses. Let's talk about memory. When it comes to memory, Ken Bailey, the name Bailey here stands for Ken Bailey, he was a missionary to Bedouin tribes in the Middle East who were illiterate. Okay? They didn't read or write. So what he did was he made an observation. He also studied the New Testament, was familiar with the Gospels, and he made an observation. He says, I am familiar with 3 kinds of orality in the world. There's 3 different types of ways orality can work in the world. One is what he called informal and uncontrolled. That a story circulates, there's no oversight on it, and it can go anywhere. That's actually the model of the liberal. Model of the liberal is, there was a tradition out there, people told stories, they could do anything they wanted with it, and it could emerge in a variety of ways as a result. Bart Ehrman, in his book on New Testament Introduction, which by the way is probably the most widely read New Testament introduction in the universities in the West, published by Oxford University Press. It's already gone through 7 editions, I believe. 6 or 7. Anyway, in the book he talks about someone telling a miracle story you just meet and encounter on a street in the Mediterranean. And his point is it can go anywhere. In fact, he compares it to what we call, I actually like the name that it's given to it in Australia and in Oceania, Chinese whispers. Okay, Chinese whispers is the story is you tell a story to someone and they have to tell the next person and the next person and the next person, but they can't use any notes. Okay, and the part of the game is you take it through several iterations, and the fun of the game is what is the story that emerges at the end of that sequence versus the beginning. It's called the telephone game. It's what we call it in the States. And so Ehrman says that orality in the ancient world is like the telephone game. Okay, the model for orality that is applied to biblical studies when it was beginning to be studied in the early part of the 20th century were folklore stories from Iceland, medieval Iceland. That was the basis for the study. I tease people, well, at least they got the beginning letter of the location right. Okay? But Iceland is not Israel. And so we had informal, uncontrolled. That's one model. That's the way Bailey describes it. When there was pushback against this offer in New Testament studies coming out of the 1920s, the pushback was, that's a bad analogy and that's a bad location for studying the way in which this works. Let's go to the rabbis. The rabbis are in the right place. They represent the right culture. And Bailey has described this as formal and controlled. Okay? It is very precise. Only certain people can tell the story. It's formally overseen and it's controlled in how the story is told. Okay? And it is very, very precise. In fact, down to the word. And so a lot of people who are in New Testament who had a more conservative take on this said that's the analogy. It comes from the right place. The rabbis just come 1 century after Jesus. And that's the way. The trouble is it was too good. It was too accurate. Because what we see in the Gospels is we see stories that are told, but they're not always told with word-for-word agreement. So there's variation on the one hand, but the gist is the same. So you got to be able to deal with the variation. That's the trick that you have. So Bailey said, what I see going on in the New Testament is like what I see with the Bedouin tribes I hang out with in the Middle East. And he described this as informal but controlled. Informal means anyone can tell the story, but it's controlled in that, one, there's some room for variation, but the gist has got to be the same, and it's overseen by elders in the community. So if someone deviates from the story too much when they tell it in public, the elder will correct them, okay, and set the story right. So Bailey was making the point that the New Testament orality model is this third model. Anyone can tell the story, but it's controlled and was controlled in the beginning by the apostolic storytelling and tradition. I need to make one other point, and that is that when you think about the gospel stories about Jesus and you compare it to the Challenger experiment that I just talked about, there's a couple of very important differences. One, you are not dealing with individual memory, you're dealing with corporate memory. You're not dealing with the memory of one person, you're dealing with the memory of many persons. Okay? We've got the 12. The second thing to point out is not only are you dealing with the 12, but you're also dealing with the fact that these stories were told again and again and again and again. They were repeated in the church services. So this wasn't one incident that happened and then you had to remember it over all time. No, it was a story that was told and then was retold and it was retold and it was retold. So now I like to have a little fun. So I began to think about what kinds of experiences in our own culture match the kind of oral environment that we're talking about in the ancient world. And I thought of my grandkids before they could read or write. Okay? My grandkids, up until the point they can read or write, are in the exact situation of remembering the stories and events that they encounter, and they don't write it down, they don't record it, they just remember what it is that they've been told. And then I thought of Star Wars when my kids were growing up. Or, even more fun, reading a book to them at night. And so one of the most exciting assignments that a parent has is to do the evening reading before you put your child to bed. Because the goal is to calm them down and get them calm enough that they will sleep through the night. And my rule was, it really is preferable if a child, once he goes to sleep at night, a young child, once he goes to sleep, is down for the evening. Okay, that was the premise. Okay, that's where we were trying to go. All right? So we used to read Bible stories to our kids at night, and I would let them pick the story, and of course they would pick the stories that they loved, so they would hear the same story again and again and again and again. Now I have to admit to you that there's a mischievous streak in me, and so when I would do this with my kids sometimes, just to see if they were following along and engaged or whether they were unengaged or not, I would change the story. Guess what happened? Daddy, that's not how it goes. And it wasn't said, Daddy, that's not how it goes. No, Daddy, that's not how it goes. It was said with emotion. And if they were really upset, they would tell me the way the story goes. Okay? It was in their heads due to the repetition and the fact that they cared about the story. Okay? That's the way orality in important contexts works. So this is the way to think about orality. I think in this third category, we see the variation on the one hand, but we know that the gist is true. And then the point that I make behind that is, and surely, the 12 knew what Jesus thought of himself, having spent so much time and having him turn him teach again and again and again and again. And that's what I have to say about orality. It also picks up the role of corporate memory. It's tied to worship. It's repeated, not simply recalled after time. There are multiple witnesses. Something is at stake in a polemical context. And so there's official transmission, informal but controlled. And then my last point is this. When the early church received the Gospels and made the decision, this Gospel we're going to circulate, I really deeply believe that the people who circulated it knew who had sent them the mail package with the book in it. Okay? So when the DHL delivered the gospel to the church, all right, the church knew who the return address was from. Let me illustrate that for you. Because sometimes there's debate about we really don't know who the authors of the Gospels are. So I'm going to illustrate this with the Gospel of Mark. The liberal claim about authorship is we don't know who really wrote a gospel. So what the church did was pick some luminary to associate with the gospel to raise its credibility. Okay, so let's do that experiment with the Gospel of Mark. What we know about the Gospel of Mark obviously is claimed to be written by Mark. But we can't, in thinking about this model, think about Mark as the author of the second Gospel. Because that's up for grabs. All right? So, what do we know about Mark? We know two things. Went home to mama before the end of the first missionary journey. Didn't survive the first missionary journey. Second thing that we know about Mark is caused a dispute between Barnabas and Paul, so that when it came time for the second missionary journey, they undertook two different missionary journeys. That is the sum of the resume that Mark offers us. Here's something else that we know. Papias claims in the tradition that Mark got his material from Peter. Okay? And this is an early text. This is an early 2nd century text. Okay? So let's think about Peter's resume. Okay? You can help me now. Think about Peter's resume. What goes into the resume of who Peter is? Well, okay. Now on the negative side, denial. Okay? But so I don't want to make the point that because Peter denied Jesus, he got to be a writer of a gospel. Okay? Why? Huh? He what? He knew Jesus. Yeah. How well did he know Jesus? Okay, how do we know that? He's part of what group? He's part of the 12. Okay, is he just a part of the 12? Okay, he's part of the 3. Is he just part of the 3? He's the leader. Every list of the 12 starts with who? Peter. Okay? That's why the Peter became the Pope. No, just kidding. Okay? All right. Okay? All right. So look at this. So I have the right, the model is, I have the right to attach to a gospel the name of someone who's going to raise the status of this gospel, because we actually don't know who the author is. And your choice, ladies and gentlemen, okay, you get to make the call. Your choice is it's either Peter or Mark. If that was the situation, who would you choose? And it's not even close. And yet the tradition says the gospel was written by Mark, despite that tradition about its being associated with Peter. That also explains something else that skeptics raise, and that is, why would Matthew, if he came later, use so much of Mark if he wasn't the first gospel written, but he was later? And the answer is really simple. And that is because Mark got his material from who? Peter. Okay? So it wasn't the author that mattered, it was the sourcing of the tradition that mattered. Okay? Thus that became useful and Matthew used it. Okay? Because it's part of the church tradition. So I'm trying to suggest to you the ways in which this gap worked. That's the point that I'm making. So let's start with the issues of differences and differences. In a skeptical context, what normally happens with differences is they're not called just differences, they're called contradictions. So I want to raise for you the possibility that difference doesn't necessarily mean contradiction. So I want to go through a series of examples. I'm going to show you how at least an alternative position can be put forward for those things. And then we'll open it up for questions. This is going to take me a little bit of time because I've got a lot of examples. But the first is Mark 1:2. So, we are at a Christian event, so maybe we should open up the Bible. So if you have your device with you or you brought an actual physical text because you're committed to the manuscript tradition of the New Testament, open up your Bibles to Mark chapter 1. Okay, here is verse 2. As it is written in Isaiah the prophet, "Behold, I send my messenger before your face who will prepare your way. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight." John appeared baptizing in the wilderness and proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. That's the unit. Now, I hopefully have some Bible scholars in the audience who can tell me, where does "Behold, I send my messenger before your face who will prepare your way," where does that come from? It doesn't come from Isaiah. You know where it comes from? Malachi chapter 3. Okay? This is a fused citation. It's a traditional citation. It's a fused citation. It has Malachi 3 in it, and then the citation about a voice crying in the wilderness, that's from Isaiah. Okay? So what the claim is made, oh look, Mark has made a mistake here. He has cited something from Isaiah that actually includes something from Malachi, and he hasn't told us that. The impression is left, it's all Isaiah. In fact, the response from saying that this is from Isaiah is exactly the kind of misleading conclusion that this citation generates. So that's the nature of the problem. So now I'm going to show you the way in which you solve the problem. So, yes, it's true. He says it's Isaiah, and it is a mixed citation. Malachi and Isaiah are brought together. They are brought together because in Judaism there is this principle called the Gezerah Shavah. You link together two passages because they share terminology. Okay? So if you look at this in the English, you can see it because the term prepare is in both citations. All right? If you were to look at this in the Greek, you would have the reference to the way also that is shared in both citations. So you have prepare and the way that link the two passages together. That's the first observation to make. The second observation is the more important observation to make, however, which is that the idea of John the Baptist being in the wilderness only attaches to one of those two citations. Guess which citation it attaches to? The one from Isaiah. Okay? So, here's what's going on. What's going on is you have a Jewish practice with a fused text, which sometimes happens when they discuss the Hebrew Scriptures. And what probably also happens are two things. One is, if I have two authors, but I have one of those prophetic figures who's the more dominant figure, I cite the fused text in light of the dominant figure. If I had a choice between Isaiah, I love asking these questions. If I have a choice between Isaiah and Malachi, who are you going to pick? Okay? All right, it's going to be Isaiah. So that's the first thing. But the second reason Isaiah is picked is because the application made out of the passage comes from the Isaiah's portion of the citation. Okay? So I've got a difference here. It's a real difference. But it's not an error. It's actually culturally intended by the way in which Jews of the first century exposited their texts. Okay? So that's the first example. Second example I have on the slide is Jesus' utterance from the cross. And since Bart Ehrman is our favorite skeptic, we're going to cite something that he says. Bart Ehrman says, you realize that the portrait of Jesus in two of the Gospels is very different as Jesus faces the cross and is hanging on the cross. In Mark, he says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Psalm 22, verse 1. And he's despairing. He's suffering on the cross. And then in Luke, we get this citation, into your hands I commit my spirit, a note of trust that God is going to vindicate him, coming from Psalm 31 and verse 5. And so difference equals contradiction. See, those two gospel writers don't agree with one another. They have two very different pictures of Jesus about his time on the cross. That's the argument. Reply. There is a thing called a synopsis. A synopsis takes the gospel stories in the synoptic gospels. That's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's called synoptic because it's made up of two Greek words, sun, which means together, and optic, which means see together. Because the Matthew, Mark, and Luke overlap on telling so many of the same events. Well, there's been a tool that's designed for scholars in which you take the wording of each gospel in any given event and you put them side by side so you can compare them to one another for the agreements and differences. Okay? So when you take a synopsis of the scene of Jesus hanging on the cross and what he says from the cross, in Mark, you get, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And then later on in the story, he says, and Jesus cried out a second time. But he doesn't tell you what Jesus said. When you put Luke's version of the cross in the synopsis and you look at it, the declaration by Jesus, into your hands I commend my spirit, comes at the very point where Mark is saying, and Jesus cried out a second time. Luke is supplying to you what Jesus said the second time, even though, and in the midst of doing that, is presenting where Jesus ended up at the end of his cross experience, because it came later rather than at the beginning. And so that's the second example. One of the reasons Ehrman says this is because Luke does not cite, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? So that's why. But when you lay out the story in the synopsis, what you will see is the citation that Luke lands on is not the moment of suffering. By the way, Mark's gospel highlights the fact that the Messiah is going to suffer. But rather the trust that Jesus has that I'm being sent to the cross, I'm going to die, but God is going to vindicate me. I am going to be raised from the dead, which is, of course, what that citation is signaling. Into your hands I commit my spirit. What's God going to do with Jesus' spirit after his death? He's going to raise him from the dead. So that's the second example, Jesus' cries from the cross. And you can see I'm picking different kinds of things as I take you through this list. The third one is formulated this way. And these are differences again between the Gospels. In Matthew, the disciples are told to go to Galilee to await their instructions. In Luke, they're told to stay in Jerusalem until they're clothed with power from on high. So, skeptic comes along and says, difference equals contradiction. Which is it? Did they go to Galilee or did they stay in Jerusalem? Were they supposed to receive their instructions in Galilee, or were they supposed to receive their instructions in Jerusalem? That's the way it gets posed. Now, this is a case where I think you have to think through the background and the context of what's going on here. Because when the disciples came to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, they were coming as pilgrims in conjunction with the Torah, and their intent had been to come to Jerusalem, celebrate the feast, and guess what they were going to do? They were going to go back home. They never had in the back of our minds, we're moving to Jerusalem. Okay? So what that means is that in order to wait in Jerusalem long term for whenever it is that the Spirit of God was going to come, they were going to have to go back to Galilee and organize and gather themselves for a long-term stay in Jerusalem. And so the instruction that goes back to Galilee is a natural one, given the fact they were there as pilgrims. But the instruction to wait in Jerusalem until they're clothed with power from on high tells them they are going to launch whatever the next phase of ministry is, not from Galilee, but from Jerusalem. Okay? And that's not an either-or choice, which is the way it gets framed. It's a both-and choice. Okay, that's the third example. Now, I've got other examples on a separate slide, so let me go there. Sometimes what you get is the same story with different details. And I've got a variety of examples of this. So, and again, I'm back to the orality principle I talked about earlier. You get variation and gist. You get difference on the one hand, but that difference does not impact the thrust of what that passage is saying. And so my key example for this actually isn't a gospel text. It's a text in Acts, or text in Acts, about when Saul was converted when he encountered Jesus on the Damascus Road. This is told 3 different times by the same author, which shows I can tell you the same story in different ways. Okay? Coming from the same writer and the same mind. And it's told with some significant difference. For example, in Acts chapter 9, Ananias is a major figure in the storytelling because Paul receives the commission that he's going to be an apostle to the Gentiles from Ananias. By the time we get to the third telling in Acts 26, Ananias is missing in action. He's not even told in that version of the story. Now, granted, you could say, well, yes, it's the same author, but he's telling the same story 3 times. And when he tells it the last time, he doesn't need to mention Ananias because he's already mentioned him. What's interesting is, in much of the retelling of this scene, things are reproduced almost word for word from version to retelling. Luke does this with other events in Luke Acts as well. So my only point here is, I think that shows, Acts 9, 22 and 26 shows the variation in retelling an oral story that is now being written down. And then in this case, we've got the example of one author who's doing it. Okay? So that's kind of the model that I'm trying to think about in the background. So let's go to the parable of the soils. Okay? Another example. So for this, we've got to open up our Bibles and do a little exercise. And for this, we're going to start off in Mark chapter 4. Okay, so go to 4:15. Okay, this is the parable of the sower. And I'm only going to deal with the seed, the interpretation of the seed that fell on the road. Okay, here's Mark 4:15. And these are the ones along the path where the word is sown, and when they hear, Satan immediately comes and takes away the word that is sown in them. Okay? Now, God gave you a memory that's called a cache. Okay? So put Satan in your memory. Put Satan in your cache. Okay? Now let's go to Matthew 13. And we're going to be in verse 19. Okay, here it is. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. So we've got Satan in Mark, an evil one in Matthew. Luke. Let's go to Luke. Luke, we're in chapter 8, and we are in verse 12. Okay? The ones along the path are those who have heard. Then the devil comes and takes away the word from their hearts so that they may not believe and be saved. I've got difference, but I've got gist. Okay? So I have Satan in Mark. I have evil one in Matthew. And I have the devil in Luke. Is there a difference? Yes. Is the referent the same? Yes. Okay? In each case, we're referring to the same entity, just with different descriptions. Okay? So that's, again, an example of variation and gist, which I've been talking to you about all through these examples. Okay, the next one is a completely different kind of example. It is the story of the centurion slave, which is in Matthew 8 and Luke 7. If you read the version in Matthew, the sense that you have is that Jesus and the centurion had a face-to-face conversation. Okay? In Luke, the centurion and Jesus never talk face-to-face. Everything that happens through Jewish emissaries. 2 waves of Jewish emissaries speak on behalf of the centurion. Liberal comes along and says, look, variation, difference, contradiction. Okay? So I'm supposed to peel out my hair and get my hairline. Okay? That's where we're at. So what's going on here? What's going on here is a difference in storytelling in which one is a more summary version and the other is the full detail. And what I mean by that is there is a cultural thing happening in the background that allows for the move allows for the move that Matthew makes. And it is the principle of the shaliach. The shaliach means one who is sent on behalf of another. Okay? So I'm going to send someone on my behalf to speak on my behalf. That's the idea. In fact, Jesus says this about the apostles when he says, the one who hears you hears who? Hears me. Okay? So that's the principle. We actually live by this principle today. I'll try and do an illustration that I think will work. When the press secretary speaks at the White House, whether it's a he or a she, we don't care who the he or the she is. What's important is they're speaking as the secretary on behalf of the sign that's sitting above their head at the lectern, White House. They're speaking on behalf of the president, and we take the press secretary's word seriously because we think it's coming from and represents the position of the White House. Okay, so we actually have this principle or variation of it today in our own world. So the point here is that when the emissaries speak on behalf of the centurion and represent his request for healing, they are speaking on his behalf. It's in effect as good as his being there, which then Matthew has simplified in his story. And the reason you get the difference is because Luke cares about something that Matthew cares less about. Luke cares about the reconciliation between Jews and Gentiles. How do I know that? The Bible tells me so. Where? In the book of Acts. The whole point of the book of Acts is to tell the story about how Jews and Gentiles have been brought together into a new community by God. So he's going to talk about the details in the scene where Jews and Gentiles are cooperating. Jewish emissaries are coming on behalf of a Gentile centurion to appeal for the healing of this centurion's servant who needs to be healed. Okay, so there's that one. I'm going to only do one of the last two because I want to summarize. Jairus' daughter, another example where Matthew summarizes and simplifies. In Mark and in Luke, this is the only place where we get a double miracle, where on the way to Jesus doing one miracle, another miracle is performed. So Jairus has a sick daughter, and Jairus comes to Jesus, asks for the healing, and on the way he's bumped into, if I can say it that way, a woman with a hemorrhage, okay? And when he feels the power go out of him, that's the way Luke says it, when he feels the power go, he stops to talk to the woman, okay? And I tell people, if you're Jairus in the midst of this scene, you're not happy this conversation is taking place. You're really not happy this conversation is taking place by what happens next, because a messenger from Jairus' house comes and says, don't bother the teacher anymore, your daughter has died. Okay? So everything about this is a mess as far as Jairus is concerned. All right? And then Jesus, of course, goes and raises Jairus' daughter. That's the version that you get in Mark and in Luke. What happens in Matthew? In Matthew, the 14 verses of Mark are reduced to 8 verses in Matthew. He's summarizing. And so he says, Jairus had a dead daughter. He doesn't go through the details of when Jesus was informed that the daughter died. The only thing that Matthew's concerned about is by the time Jesus got to Jairus' house, the daughter was quite dead. Thank you very much. And so that's the way, that's a difference, but it's a difference in telling. So how do I characterize this? I characterize this as guy and gal telling, although I will tell you, by the way I tell you this, that it's not a matter of gender. Okay? But here's the way it works. Some people tell the story one way and other people tell the story the other. It's their personalities that tell. When I interview people for my podcast, there are two kinds of people. They're what I call soundbite people. I ask a question, I get a crisp answer. And then what I call footnote people. I ask a question, I get all the background before they answer my question. Okay? A lot of academics, I hate to tell you, are footnote people. Okay? They live in the details. Okay? The details matter. So here's my illustration of it. If I ask my wife, do I have to be at dinner tonight? Okay? What my wife is likely to do, drives me crazy. Okay? But I love her. Okay? Well, she's likely to go through my schedule of the day and then explain why my presence is or is not required at dinner. Okay, that's just the way she works. Okay, I always get more than I bargained for when I ask a question of my wife. All right? If she asks me whether she needs to be at dinner tonight, she's going to get a short answer. Okay? She's going to get a yes or a no. Okay? I will only supply the explanation if an explanation is needed. All right? Otherwise, I'm just going to answer the question. Thank you very much. Okay? I'm a busy person. All right? So that's the way it works. All right? But this is not a guy or gal thing. I have a colleague, Hall Harris, who's married to a German wife. She's now passed away, but I've used this illustration for a long time, so I keep it. Anyway, if you ask Ursula if Hall has to be at dinner in the evening, you're going to get a ja or a nein. Okay? I had to use that illustration. We're in Europe. Okay? But if you ask Hall if Ursula has to be at dinner, Hall is a person I've taught with him, and I've nicknamed him. He's the ultimate footnote person. I've nicknamed him Dr. Google. Okay? He can tell you things and has thought about things no one has ever dreamed of thinking about. Okay? So if you ask Hall if Ursula has to be at dinner tonight, you will get the history of Greco-Roman hospitality, okay, before you get to the answer to the question. Okay? All right? People tell things in different ways. That's the point. And so some of these differences are differences because people tell stories differently. It's just the way that they work. And now, a critic will sometimes criticize us in some of the things that I've just done by saying, "Oh, you're harmonizing." Only I mean you're harmonizing. Okay, it's almost like an exorcism. Okay, don't do that. All right. So you're harmonizing. Okay, and they'll regard harmonization as a terrible thing. But actually, when you're dealing with the same events from the perspective of different people, you've got to ask the question what the relationship is between the telling that you're getting from the various people who are participating in the storytelling. All right? So that's that category. Let me mention one that's not on the list but got raised as a question that fits here. It's a completely different kind of problem. It's the problem of Quirinius' census, the date of Quirinius' census, the date of Jesus' birth, etc. All the historical evidence that we have says that Quirinius' census came in AD 6, which is too late for Jesus' birth. Okay, because Jesus was born around the time that Herod the Great died. We know Herod the Great died around 4 BC. So it's 10 years off, basically. So what do we do with it? It's a major historical problem. In fact, I view it as the major historical problem in Luke Acts. So, and it is really a problem because all the extra biblical evidence only associates Quirinius with the census in 6 AD. And I always say, you have to imagine the context in which you're operating in order to understand some of these things. The context that we're operating in is how quick does it take a government to plan for something and then execute it? Okay? The census that Joseph is asked to be a part of requires the registration of people so that down the road they could tax those people. They're gathering the registration. These things in government often take time. I'm reminded of a highway that was supposed to be expanded when I was a college student in Dallas in the late 1970s. Central Expressway was the major highway that ran through the city, went from Houston, took you on to Oklahoma City. And that for years, because of the expansion of the population in Dallas, which was growing then at the time and it's never stopped, they said, we need to expand Central Expressway. They were talking about this as an idea and a concept to pursue and making the plans for it and everything else in the 1970s. That highway did not get built to where I could drive on it, okay, until the late 1990s. Okay? Government sometimes does not move with the speed of light. All right? Now, it can when it wants to, but it doesn't have to. So here, I think one of the things that we're dealing with here is a census that became associated with Quirinius because that's when it was actually executed. But the planning and leading up to it, the preparation for it, okay, actually may predate when Quirinius was governor. And We are not in a digital environment, okay, right? We're in a very slow world of the ancient world. And that process took time. That's my argument for what's going on. Now, there are other people who explain other things. Some people will claim Quirinius was governor twice, but we really only know about the one from Josephus. The other is a grammatical explanation that says that basically when you translate it, you would translate it before Quirinius was governor. Do it that way. There are two other ways to explain that text. My point at this point is, if any one of those options is the case, then the idea that this is an error is premature.